All right. I hope everyone is hydrating and ready. I will be talking more today, so ready to go. We'll be kicking things off with the Antiquary today. So, as mentioned, anyone who read the blog, we kind of have a vague understanding of the spec. So, as always, we're going to go over all the new profession stuff, all the new utility skills, all the new traits. Don't even have the correct elite skill equipped here. But the first things first, the Antiquary is kind of this like a collector of various artifacts from across Tyria. So we're going to see all those different artifacts as we use Grit Snatch. This is a new replacement for Steel. This is just going to be a ranged, kind of similar to Deadeye in that sense, where it's not going to be a forced teleport in, but you're going to have a ranged button that gives you your stolen bundles. That will, in this case, be drawn from a random collection of these artifacts. And the idea is that every time that you Grit Snatch, the baseline is you're just going to have two of these. You see, this might be teasing towards something where the F4 button appears. We'll get to that once we get into the traits. But we're going to get access to a couple of different artifacts. There's a pool of 8 different artifacts that we can draw from. 4 of them are more offensively focused, 4 of them are more defensively focused. And the idea is that, you know, every time that you Grit Snatch, you will get a couple of these, or maybe even a few of these, depending on your trait selections. And that is going to kind of play into your decision making as you adapt to the situation at hand as you draw these. And obviously, there is an element of randomness to this. Once we get into the traits, we're gonna see the adept tier is entirely dedicated to ways to mitigate that randomness, because we know as designers, as we're putting this together, that there's always a fine line to walk when we're making something that has a little bit more inherent randomness than other things that just don't have any. And we want to make sure that there's opportunities for this randomness to exist and kind of that fun, moment-to-moment decision making to happen without having like too many low roll situations that feel really bad, or like really high roll situations that blow out, so that when you're trying to do your DPS benchmark and you get your 1% high roll, that is your like 80k DPS or something. That's not really what we're going for. There will be some things that are slightly more powerful than others, because that is going to just play into, there's going to be some skills that are just raw damage and some that have a little bit more utility baked in. Or we'll see, like, as we get into the traits, there's some mitigation there, and then we're also going to be keeping a very close eye on this as we get into the beta and, all the feedback around this, seeing like how much of the randomness works, how much, maybe we need to have a little bit more mitigation in their baseline. We'll see how it goes, but the idea is that we have kind of a wider collection of really powerful stolen bundles, and every time that you steal, you're going to get a couple of these or a few of these. So we're going to run through all of these. I'm going to use some developer cheats so that the stream doesn't take a while to go through all of them. Because you never know what you're going to grab, but I'm just going to give myself some. I guess it's worth mentioning, every time that you steal, you can use one of these 2 bundles by default. Obviously, if you have improvisation, that's going to let you use another one, and there might even be a trait that allows you to use a 3rd stolen skill every time that you pilfer or Grit Snatch. So we're going to kick things off with all of the offensive bundles. Starting off with the Metal Legion guitar. This one's a bit more of a kind of like a hybrid-y damage and a little bit of CC in there as well. So we're going to walk over here to some of our enemy golems, play the guitar. That's going to do some pulsing damage, apply some confusion, and then we're going to slam the guitar down, do a little bit of extra damage, and a nice little stun there. So, we're going to see like some condition damage elements on some of these skills as well. So there's going to be a mix of power damage and condition damage, and you obviously see some CC here as well. So this skill will probably do a little bit less damage than some of the pure DPS skills that we see a little bit later. You can play this a few times. I'm cheating, so I can just use this skill as many times as I want, and there's nothing that these golems can do about it. But, as we kind of showed off earlier, you will only get to use these a single time.
You can move with the guitar, just in case it's not.
Oh yeah, you
want to rock out. So you're not rooted that entire time.
I'm gonna
follow people,
run down the stage and slam my guitar or something like that. Next up, we're going to take a look at the Forged Surfer Dash. This one's going to be a ground-targeted dash. Still a little bit more offensively focused. We'll see a couple of mobility skills on the defensive end as well. But this one is just going to be a mobility skill that drops some exploding bombs on the ground. So we can see this here, dashing through all these golems, dropping a bunch of AoEs on the ground. That's going to do some pretty relevant damage and burning. So a nice little mobility skill. You can obviously use this to run away as well, and enemies chasing you might run over all your bombs or force dodges or whatever have you, but a nice little combo of mobility and damage on this one. Get a close-up on this dash. It's pretty cool riding the Forged Surfer stuff, surfing across the stage, if you will. Next up, we're going to take a look at the Cryptus turret. So this one is just going to be ground targeted. Place this on the ground somewhere. You see the little script assistant is hanging off of that. I don't know if that happens all the time. I've seen it sometimes where it doesn't, so that's a nice little bonus that you might notice sometimes.
A lot of the effects have little script in them for you to see.
Sometimes your little script assistant will appear, but this is a pretty straightforward. Summon the turret. This is going to be like the main bread and butter damage skill. Only does damage, but it's going to shoot at the nearest enemy and do some pretty nice damage. Obviously, you can deploy this at range. Not at your friends, it won't attack them, but you can try your best, I guess. Next up, we have the Mistburn Mortar. This is another one of the pretty aggressive damage skills. This one is going to fire off and create an area that is pulsing some burning. I think I might actually have a trait on right now. No, I don't have a trait on right now. This is going to be a nice little ranged pulsing field. Does some burning, does some damage. Nice little well of whatever you want to call it. But it's again, going to be one of the more powerful offensive skills because it is just a raw damaging ability. Next, we'll start to take a look at some of the defensive artifacts. Starting with the Exalted Hammer. So this one's going to be an evade. Also, 600 range leap, so we can leap over here. The idea is that it is going to do some damage. This is something that even the defensive artifacts are going to have a little bit of damage attached to them because, again, we want to kind of mitigate some of the low-rolly aspects where if you are in a situation where you want to use a defensive artifact, you can still use it and get some amount of damage. It's obviously not going to be as much damage as any of the offensive artifacts, but you will still get that defensive capability, get that evade, get some healing, and still do a little bit of damage if you're landing on an enemy. But, a nice little defensive skill with a nice little heal attached to that. And slam the ground with the Exalted Hammer. Next up, we're going to see the Chalk Shield. So this one is more of a projectile destruction type of defensive skill. So we're going to drop it down. We see our little Scrit Assistant helping us out here, creating the barrier that is going to destroy projectiles. This is also going to pulse some damage to enemies in the area. It's also a light field if you find some use for that, combo through it if you really want to. But the big thing here is that this is going to be that powerful projectile destruction defensive skill. Close up on our little friend here. Couple more artifacts to look at before we move on, but next up we have the Zephyrite Sun Crystal. This one's going to be a stun break, also another one of those ground targeted dashes, and does have a little bit of a burning attached to it at the end here, but you can always use this to get away or dash in. You're going to be having that long duration evade if you're going kind of the max distance, and then we're also going to have that nice little burning explosion at the end. So again, stun break as well, and then long distance dash with evasion. Pretty powerful defensive skill. And last but not least, we have the Hollow Dancer Decoy. This one's going to be more of a crowd control-y type of effect. It does do some damage in crowd control, but it is kind of tied in with the defensive artifacts we see here. We summon the Scrit Hollow Dancer. The enemies are all distracted and taunted, and then it explodes, doing some damage. So, pretty long taunt, 3 seconds baseline here. And that can obviously set up some of your offensive skills if you are playing like the improv build, or obviously your own weapon skills, or some of the double-edged skills that we will get to very shortly. Anything you wanted to add on the artifacts, Taylor, before we move on?
I just want to know, would the Scrit Hollow Dancer work on you, Cal?
I'm not sure it would, but it probably would because it'll just taunt me, and everyone knows that taunt is my favorite condition in Guild Wars 2.
Right, of course.
Kind of unavoidable, There's something alluring about it, right? Anyway, let's go ahead and move on to double-edged skills, and then we'll get into the traits. So, we talked about this mechanic a little bit in the blog as well, where the double-edged skills are essentially... The best way to describe them is kind of like a flip skill, where there is two parts. There's the baseline that you'll always use initially, and then there is the secondary component, which is called the backfire. And the way that this mechanic works is, after I use the skill, it's going to do, what it does. And then as it's recharging, you have the opportunity to use the skill again. And the idea is that, in this, right there, I didn't get the backfire, so I was able to use the base skill again with essentially no downside, or on a shorter recharge than is typically intended. And that's going to be based off how much of the skill recharge is left. So if there's 50% of this recharge remaining, then I have a 50% chance to backfire. And in this case, I did get the backfire, and then it goes on full recharge. You can't continue to activate it as soon as the skill has backfired. So a lot of these are more of a risk-reward that we'll see on some of the utilities. But for the heal, we kept it pretty straightforward. It is more of just an all upside where, you can just use this button. You'll probably just press this button back to back because you want to get that big heal, get that big cleanse. But there's going to be a lot more decision making as we get into some of the rest of these skills here. This is just a good example of like how the mechanic works, and there's really no downside to backfiring, but we are able to, have that, I guess, extra decision point, because there will be times where you just want like this sustained heal, and maybe you press it with like 3 seconds left because you think, okay, well now I get a pretty low chance of getting that failure state. I can just use my heal a little bit more often than I typically can. And then sometimes you are going to want that double tap, more likely to backfire. I didn't even backfire there with a 70% chance. Quite lucky. Wow, I'm just on a roll today with my... So, we will see some of that as we get into the utility skills as well. There's going to be a lot more powerful downsides, I guess you would say, or a large opportunity cost of some of these backfire skills. But the idea is that, the baseline is there is just this skill that you press, and it gives you a baseline effect, and then you can just ignore the mechanic if you want to and never risk backfiring. But there is always going to be like, you can save a couple seconds off your cooldown and have a pretty low % chance for something to go wrong. Maybe you want to roll the dice. So again, anti-venom drop, pretty straightforward. Small heal and Condy removal on a low cooldown, or you can go for that backfire, get a big heal, big Condy removal, and it will go on a longer cooldown when that happens. Next up, we'll take a look at the Stone Summit Cannon. So this is going to conjure another Scrit helper to kind of fire this cannon. We're going to see it does a pretty big AoE burning, AoE damage. Oh, and I got the backfire there right away. I'm just going to show this skill off a few times without risking the backfire. We do see just a pretty strong DPS skill here. Big damage, big burning, long range. Well, 900 range, more of that mid-rangey type range. But then we did see the backfire there. Let's just show it off. Yeah. Real time. The idea is that the cannon itself kind of does a backfire. So the Sprit's like, what's going on? And then it explodes and it does a bunch of damage. Notably, this will deal damage to yourself as well, but it is pretty easy to walk out of, as we saw. So we're just going to fire that off I'm going to walk out of it. These golems are going to stand there, and they're going to get hit by an even stronger burst of burning and a bit of damage as well. So, this sets up really well with CC skills, or, other players CCing for you, or bosses that typically don't move very much. Pretty low risk because it is, once again, there I got a pretty rapid succession of multiple uses of the base skill into that backfire. It's very easy for you to walk out of it, so this one again is pretty low risk, and if you are looking for that burst of damage, it might be something that you want to press back to back.
Can I get you to do a close-up on the Scrit during the backfire?
Oh,
Just
yeah.
make sure that everyone sees what's going on there.
Getting incredibly lucky again. Showing up one more time.
No.
What's going on? There's something wrong with this. And then
If you were playing this spec with the goal to do the most damage, what would your number be, Cal? What percent chance would be risking to do the backfire? Because I think, normally taking like a 10% chance with like a second left on the cooldown seems pretty good. Get a lot of value sustained, but...
Well, I mean, this skill doesn't go on a longer cooldown, so I'm just double tapping this all the time.
Right.
Because, I can press W and I can walk out of this. That's no problem. I don't know, maybe the boss is going to CC me and it's all going to go wrong. Next up, we will take a look at the Inquest portal device. So this one's going to be a bit more mobility as well. We're going to see it does a shadow step, does a little bit of damage, a little bit of vulnerability, kind of like that setup, dash in, kind of that scene of infiltration type skill. And then the backfire, this is a pretty powerful skill that if you could use it back to back, so there's a pretty big downside here as well. If you do backfire on this shadow step, I didn't because I waited a long time, playing it safe. But here we go again. That's going to knock you down. So this is more of a break in case of emergency type skill where if you are, porting away from somebody and then you need to port away again, you're obviously going to get knocked down, maybe combo with a stun break or you have stability. There's definitely options with this skill, but a lot of the time you will probably just use the front half of the skill and then the backside will be purely for emergencies. Or, maybe you can get really lucky and shadow step multiple times in quick succession.
You gotta be ready for the backfire because life comes at you fast. Porting in but getting knocked down, that seems maybe not the best thing to happen to you. So
it's definitely a high risk, but again, a very powerful effect being able to shadow step multiple times off one skill. Yeah. So we'll see that again as we get into the next skill here, Emergency Jade Shield. This is going to be a stun break, and notably, the backfire side of this is also a stun break. So the base of this skill is we're just going to get a little bit of barrier. We're going to do a stun break, so a nice little defensive skill here. And the backfire is that you will have the shield kind of explode, so you will take a lot of damage. I can stop cheating all super heavily here, so you can just see a pretty notable amount of damage to yourself. You obviously get a little bit of barrier on top of that, and you had barrier from the front half, so there is some built-in defense. And this will do, a bit of damage as well. We are hitting this golem with this explosion in addition to ourselves, kind of the same idea that we saw with the Stone Summit Cannon. But this is, again, a very powerful defensive skill where you will have kind of almost an ammo stun break that, recharges the entirety of it every time the recharge comes down. So there is a pretty significant trade-off here for the backfire with that damage to yourself. So something that you could potentially combo off the portal device as well. Maybe you port in, and then you realize you need to port again, and then you can even just use the front half of the Jade Shield to break out of that stun. And last up here we have the Canuck coin toss. So the fun little coin flip animation here. And the idea is that things are going to happen based off of whether you flip heads or tails, and there is obviously some baseline here. So we see the front half of this skill, this is going to be more of just a initiative and condition removal skill. And if you win that coin flip, each time you win that coin flip, you'll get a little bit of an extra initiative bump and a condition converted to a boon as opposed to just a single initiative and a condition removal. But for all the statisticians in chat, you guys can do the expected value of a coin flip pretty easily. So you can see that, maybe you end up with 1.5 initiative every time you flip a coin, so 4.5 initiative every time you use that skill. And you'll convert 1.5 conditions to boons every time you press the button. But this is just more of that. Again, condition removal initiative lets you do a lot of things. If you flip 3 heads, maybe it should even give you an additional bonus initiative because you got that 1 in 8. But currently it doesn't. That's just a fun aside. But you will still get 6 initiative back and converting 3 conditions to boons on a pretty low cooldown. So a nice little initiative skill here. Then obviously you can reactivate this again. If you do backfire, we see the red coins here to indicate that something terrible has happened. This is going to be another example of like more of a break-in case of emergency, because there's going to be a pretty significant downside here where when you reuse this skill, you will always be removing boons from yourself. And when you lose the coin flip, you will even convert those boons into conditions, but it will be that more of that emergency, more initiative button. And this one, the risk reward probably quite isn't there yet. We want to maybe crank up the initiative on the backfire side so that you are, getting something for that, removing boons from yourself. Obviously, not something you want to do very often, but we do want to find the right balance for these backfires where they are actually decision points where you choose whether or not you actually want to use this secondary component of the skill. And last up, we have the elite skill here, the Sprit Scuffle. I'm going to take a quick water break as people read very quickly. But the idea here is that we're going to create an area where the Sprits they're just going wild, digging up everything, and we're going to see here that every interval, every 3 seconds, we're getting essentially a new set of artifacts. Sometime we're going to get this unstable script bomb, and this one is kind of this is something that you can use to set up yourself or your allies. You can stun break out of this, kind of like that headbutt type of self CC and enemy CC. It's supposed to be more of like a downside as opposed to just getting like the artifacts that you want. So it's intended to be a little bit less common that you'll actually use that skill, but there are going to be situations where, that is a pretty powerful CC effect. But as we see here, we're continuously getting new artifacts for the duration of this skill, and we can be firing them off, getting new artifacts. That's going to be pretty useful as we get into some of the traits that care about using artifacts. Don't want to dash out of the radius because that will prevent you from getting the next artifacts. But we do see you. Just a pretty powerful skill. You essentially get to steal 5 times is the elite skill here. Yeah, so let's just get right into the traits, because there's a lot of things that care about artifacts, and there's a lot of things that, we have some of that RNG mitigation as well. I'm going to put on improvisation because that is my favorite way to play with the Antiquary at the moment. Because again, that does give you the extra artifact uses, and we'll see even more artifact uses as we get into some of these adept traits. But starting things off, here's a Trinket Collector, explains the specialization. You can kind of scroll through all the different artifacts here. We'll come back to all of those later for all of the screenshotters. Some people may have noticed the Magpie's Defense triggering as we were kind of showing stuff off. This is going to say when you use your healing skill or elite skill, you're going to get some personal barrier. These are separate cooldowns, so I use my heal skill, I get some barrier, and I'm going to then immediately use my elite skill, get some additional barrier. So a nice little self-survivability defensive trait there. And then right away, the Enterprising Aristocrat. Every time you use an artifact skill, you're going to get some initiative back. So here, immediately we see like a big value with the elite skill. You're going to potentially get back 10 initiative every time you use your elite, and there's even more opportunity to get even more stolen skills. We'll get to that very quickly. Starting off with the kind of RNG mitigation, some people probably noticed here, we got the reshuffle here when we selected the card swap adept trait. The idea is that every time you reshuffle your artifacts, which is now a skill that you have, you can spend 2 initiative every 5 seconds to redraw. So we can just demonstrate that here. This won't redraw empty slots, so I have improvisation equipped, which means I can use both of these. So if I do use the first artifact here, my improvisation not work as intended. You break something, Taylor?
Wasn't me.
Nope. Okay, it worked this time. So we'll look into that one. But we now see when I reshuffle, I only get to redraw a single artifact because that is the only artifact that I had remaining. And this is also going to give you a little bit condition removal. So just a powerful defensive trait as well. Every 5 seconds you can spend 2 initiative and remove a condition from yourself. Next up we have the split deck. This guarantees that you'll get an offensive artifact and a defensive artifact every time you steal. This is something that we're really considering. This one should maybe even be baseline to the spec, but we want to see how it plays in the beta first, because this is going to be like a big reduction in those cases where you really need a defensive artifact and you just draw 2 offensive ones, and that feels pretty bad. And similarly, when you're just looking to maximize your damage and you draw 2 defensive artifacts, this is going to prevent you from doing that. Maybe that should just be how the mechanic works in the first place, but we're going to see like how it plays in the beta, because there is like a couple more. The bottom trait here is even more powerful, so maybe it needs to have that extra layer of randomness on top of the Prolific Plunderer. But again, play with it during the beta. Let us know what you think. We're definitely thinking about that type of thing already, where maybe you should always draw an offensive and defensive, and there could be some alternative RNG mitigation on this trait. Next up we have Prolific Plunderer. This gives you an additional artifact slot, and you can then use an additional artifact every time you pilfer. So now I have Improvisation and I have Prolific Plunderer, which means every time that I get 3 artifacts, I can use all 3 of them. Potentially very powerful, because again, we have Enterprising Aristocrat. Every time I'm using an artifact, I'm getting initiative back. This is definitely, my favorite way to play, because you just get to use all the fun toys and you get a bunch of initiative back, which means you get to use all your weapon skills a bunch. It's pretty fun. What do you think, Taylor?
Yeah, I think I also prefer just like max randomness here. As many slots you don't really get, but you gotta operate on the fly. Just take a quick look what you stole and then use them in combat. Have to really be on your feet when you play this spec, especially with this trait. So I think it makes the spec a lot more interesting when you take it.
And of course, that does make it more likely that you always draw an offensive or defensive, but it will not guarantee that, as Split Deck does. Moving into the master tier, we're going to start with Scoundrel's Luck. So this is this plays into the backfire mechanic. The idea is that every time that you use Scrit Snatch, the next time you use a double-edged skill that is recharging, it will guarantee that you get the front half of that skill again. It will not trigger the backfire. So that is potentially very strong with, one of the skills that we showed off with those more detrimental downsides with like the Emergency Jade Shield or the Inquest Portal device. That means I can, use my Scrit Snatch. It's difficult. I just say steal all the time, and it's confusing. But then we can, port in, and then we can immediately port again, and that's going to guarantee that we're not going to get knocked down there. Then we can even port again, and probably get knocked down. But it does give you essentially 1 free use of a backfire to avoid a backfire every time that you steal, which is potentially very strong with, especially these 2 skills, but all the skills, except for probably the heal. You probably don't want to use your heal to use up your Scoundrel's Luck. Next up, Meticulous Custodian. This is just going to improve all your artifacts. So again, this is a great trait with the improv build where you are getting 3 artifacts every time, able to use all 3 artifacts every time. We can kind of scroll through here. Metal Legion Guitar getting more damage, more confusion, additional stun duration. Forge Surfer Dash, we're going to see more damage, more burning. Misper Mortar, same thing, more damage, more burning. Just improvements to all of the artifacts here. The Chalk Shield, a little bit more duration, a bit more damage as well. Exalted Hammer, going to do some more damage, do some more healing. It looks like the healing number is incorrect on this specific instance, but it will be larger than the one that we saw on the initial skill in-game. And the Cryptus Turret obviously doing more damage. Hollow Dancer doing a bit more damage. The radius here is going to be larger, so even more likely to trap enemies inside. And the Zephyrite Sun Crystal going to do a little bit more burning at the end of that dash. So, the more that you're using artifacts, the more that you might find this trait valuable to make your artifacts better. Makes sense to me. And last up, we have Exhilarating Ephemera. This is just going to be more of that typical damage bonus trait. So every time you use an artifact, you're going to get some duration of this damage bonus. And we do see that you can kind of... You'll want to have either the Prolific Plunderer here or Improvisation so that you're able to use multiple artifacts to stack up that buff and kind of get the max duration of this increased damage window. Take a quick break for water and mouse over this fun Grandmaster trait.
Pretty good icon for that one.
So we have the Prodigious Pincher. This says that every time you use a certain amount of initiative, you will pilfer. So that's triggering the Scritch Snatch. It won't trigger steal traits, but it will give you a set of artifacts. So we can just show that off real quick. If I pilfer, I'm going to use all my skills, and then I'm going to stop cheating so I actually go in combat, and then I'm going to press unload a bunch of times, because that's the best way to play. I'm going to get some initiative, where you see some stacking up. We obviously get lead attacks here at the same time, but this is stacking up, and once we get to the maximum stack count, that's going to give us a free pilfer, refilling our artifacts, and we're again playing the build with improvisation and prolific plunderer, so we get to use all three of these, and that's going to give me 6 initiative back. So there's a pretty fast-paced gameplay here, where you are going to be able to be using a bunch of artifacts, giving you initiative back, using a bunch of initiative, getting more artifacts, and that's going to be kind of like an endless cycle of pilfering. It's pretty fun stuff. Next up we have Possessive Hoarder. This one is going to be a bit more of a personal survivability trait. So every time that you use an artifact, you will grant barrier to yourself, and you're also going to get a boon depending on if you used an offensive artifact or a defensive artifact. So you can get stability or you can get resistance. Again, you know, using improv and prolific plunderer, this is going to mean that I can get a pretty good number of boons, get some stability, get some more stability. I got 3 defensive artifacts, so I'm going to get a lot of stability.
Yeah, this one's pretty good with a split deck trait, so you can always guarantee you have a trigger to give you resistance or stability, whatever you need when you steal.
And then last up, we have Combat High. This is intended to be more like a bursty, you know, thieves love to do burst damage, so here's the trait that's going to do a lot of burst damage. We're always going to get a bit more sustained damage from Prodigious Pincher, just getting that increased value over time. But Combat High is going to give you a big burst of damage that every time that you Scrit Snatch, this is going to give you 10 stacks of this buff, Combat High, that says increased damage. So we see the baseline as you start at. This is a very large number. It's going to be obviously a little bit lower in competitive modes, but initially you will get that 30% damage buff, and then every couple of seconds that's going to start counting down toward 0, of course. But the idea is that you get that big burst, use a bunch of skills, immediately use all your artifacts, all your offensive artifacts, into that damage bonus, use some skills into the damage bonus, and then that's going to be true every time that you steal. You're going to be able to reset that super high damage burst.
That feels good.
Yeah, so that's all we have for the Antiquary. A lot of really fun stuff here and a lot of really cool ideas. And, you know, we talked a lot about the randomness and how we're keeping a very close eye on like how these things play, how much more mitigation do we need to make sure that the lows aren't too low, and making sure that, you know, we don't want the highs to be too high, because we don't want those situations where you do feel like not getting the highest high roll is actually a low roll. But we are trying to find the right balance of those things as we go into beta and, of course, beyond. So I'm just going to do some quick hovers for all the things, for all the screenshotters while we wrap up. And Taylor, if you have any last things to talk about as I click through all of these artifacts.
Yeah, I saw, you know, some questions around the self-damaging parts of the backfires. Those only damage yourself, they do not hurt your allies. So, you know, if you do the mortar and get the backfire, that'll only hurt you. I know some people might be sad about that, but and also some other questions. I think with regards to like roles of how this fits in places, and, you know, boons and PvE especially, I think, you know, we have ideas correct around, you know, maybe this does need to be fit into an alacrity or quickness role. We're specifically interested in the beta to see kind of the core gameplay loops, specifically with like the RNG mechanics, how backfires play, as Cal mentioned, the adept traits. So that's kind of like the focus around our feedback, but we're also keeping an eye on like, is there a way that makes sense to add, you know, some alacrity sharing or quickness sharing, whatever, what have you, with this spec, to give it some extra niches. We think, you know, the gameplay with the Grandmaster traits should be pretty interesting. Prodigious Pincher, as Cal went over. There's going to be like a lot of more sustained artifacts to hopefully give you pretty good damage over time with it. Keep that the master tier damage bonus up. but also talk about the combat high. It's kind of different from some other thief traits, and this is like specifically a really high burst trait. 30% is a really large number, as you guys are seeing, and the goal here is that we kind of augment how you play. It's a 15% damage modifier over time if you do like quick math, but you should pool your resources and then use them in that burst window, which isn't always something we see thief specs wanting to do. So hopefully it gives it a bit of a different gameplay, in PvE especially, through this trait.
All right. Yeah, for sure. And that is all of the things. So I'm going to go back here as we get set up for the Paragon.
Yeah, and I think another good question is clarifying the backfire on the Elite. The Elite you can't activate twice. The backfire is specifically the Scrit Bomb part. I believe you have a 20% chance to get that Scrit Bomb, and when you have the Scoundrel's Luck Master Tier trait, that will cause it so that you have a 0% chance to get the Scrit Bomb. So you're only getting good stuff when you have those synergies going.